You hear the scraping of velvet curtains being drawn aside. The air in the chamber is thick with incense and something else, something sour, unmistakably human. Candles flicker against mahogany panels, casting shadows that seem to recoil from what lies on the bed. You are not here as a mourner. You are here because the Queen Regent herself has summoned you, and what she asks of you now will haunt you until your own death. On the bed, beneath sheets of silk that cost more than your annual salary, lies the body of a king. But your task tonight has nothing to do with his soul. Before we step deeper into this palace of secrets, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It honestly amazes me that a story this strange, this deeply buried in royal archives can reach people across the entire world today. The year is 1833. The place is Madrid, though the opulence around you feels more like a mausoleum than a capital. Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, has just died after a reign that historians would politely call complicated and his subjects would call a curse. The official cause of death is gout. The official legacy is a fractured kingdom on the edge of civil war. But what happens in this room tonight, what you, the royal physician, are about to do, will never appear in any official record, because some truths are too strange, too intimate, too grotesque to survive the filter of history. Maria Cristina of Naples stands near the window, her mourning veil doing little to hide the tension in her jaw. She is 30 years old, a widow now, and the mother of a 3-year-old daughter whose legitimacy half of Europe doubts. She needs every advantage, every piece of leverage, every weapon. And so she has ordered you to preserve something that most men would rather forget ever existed. The king's anatomical peculiarity, his grotesque endowment, the secret that defined his reign as surely as his cruelty, his paranoia, and his spectacular failure to understand the people he ruled. You approach the bed. Even in death, Ferdinand's face wears an expression of disdain, as if mocking you from beyond the grave. But it is not his face that commands your attention now. Ferdinand was born cursed, though not in the way peasants whisper about witches or priests warn about sin. He was cursed by blood. By the deliberate, meticulous inbreeding that Spanish royalty had practiced for centuries like a sacrament. The Habsburgs and the Bourbons had spent generations marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, folding the family tree back onto itself in an obsessive effort to keep power within the bloodline. They saw it as purity. Nature saw it as an experiment in genetic catastrophe. Ferdinand emerged from this lineage on October 14, 1784, at the Escorial Palace, the son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, themselves first cousins. From the moment of his birth, the genetic lottery had already decided his fate, but no one could have predicted how cruel that fate would be. As a child, he was sickly, sullen, and prone to violent outbursts. His father was a weak king who preferred hunting to governance. His mother was a woman of voracious appetites who conducted a barely concealed affair with Manuel de Godoy, the prime minister who essentially ruled Spain while Charles played with his dogs. Young Ferdinand watched this humiliation daily, absorbing poisonous lessons about power, betrayal, and the inherent weakness of trust. But it was his body that delivered the cruelest lesson of all. As he entered adolescence, court physicians began noticing something deeply wrong. His member began developing in ways that defied medical understanding. By his teenage years, whispers echoed through the palace corridors about the royal anomaly, an organ so massive and bizarrely shaped that it seemed to belong to another species entirely. One physician, writing in coded Latin in a journal that would remain hidden for 2 centuries, described it as a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove not merely challenging, but potentially lethal to any woman unfortunate enough to be joined with His Highness. Another was more blunt. He wrote that the prince's organ resembled a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick. The psychological impact was devastating. In an era when male anatomy was judged by classical Greek ideals, where smaller was considered more refined, more aristocratic, Ferdinand's condition marked him as a freak. The very thing that lesser men might foolishly envy became a source of profound, isolating shame. He learned early that he was an object of mockery. Servants giggled behind their hands. Courtiers made subtle, cutting jokes. Foreign diplomats reported back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand absorbed every slight, every snicker, every sidelong glance, and he transformed his humiliation into something darker, into rage, into paranoia, into a cold, calculating cruelty that would one day be unleashed on an entire nation. He became secretive, vindictive, and breathtakingly cruel to those beneath him. When a young page accidentally walked in on him changing clothes, Ferdinand didn't simply dismiss the boy. He had him flogged until his back was raw, then had the boy's entire family exiled from Madrid. The message was clear. No one could witness the prince's shame and remain unpunished. This was the man who would one day wear the crown. This was the man who would decide Spain's fate. In 1802, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. She was 16, sheltered, and romantic. She had heard he was called the Desired One by some of his supporters and imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince. The wedding was magnificent. The wedding night was a nightmare. Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting had tried to prepare her, but their euphemisms and vague warnings could not convey the reality. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber, when she saw him for the first time without the careful tailoring of royal garments, she began screaming. One lady-in-waiting, writing decades later, described it as the sound of a soul breaking. What followed was less a consummation than a medical procedure. Physicians were summoned. Specially designed cushions were brought in, devices that court craftsmen had spent months perfecting in secret workshops hidden in the palace's depths. Maria Antonia had to be sedated with laudanum just to endure the process. The trauma was immediate and profound. She developed what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, flinching whenever Ferdinand entered a room, suffering nightmares that left her screaming until dawn. The marriage became a ritualized horror. Ferdinand, already insecure and paranoid, interpreted her revulsion as a personal insult and a political threat. He became convinced she was secretly mocking him, that she was in league with foreign powers to humiliate him. His paranoia infected every aspect of their relationship, turning what should have been intimacy into a theater of surveillance and suspicion. Twice, miraculously, Maria Antonia became pregnant. The court erupted in celebration, but both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages. Palace physicians quietly noted that the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's constitution had made carrying a child impossible. It was a coded admission that Ferdinand's anatomy had made the sexual act so traumatic that her body simply could not sustain new life. The second miscarriage, occurring almost at full term, destroyed what remained of Maria Antonia's sanity. She stopped eating. She developed a 1,000-yard stare. She became a ghost, haunting her own palace. When she died in May 1806, at the age of 21, the official cause was listed as fever. The truth was that she had died of despair, her body and mind shattered by years of trauma, drug addiction, and psychological abuse. Ferdinand's reaction was telling. While he made appropriate public displays of grief, privately he seemed almost relieved. Within weeks, he was already negotiating for a second wife. He had learned a terrible lesson. Other people were not individuals with their own dignity and pain. They were tools to be used, obstacles to be overcome, or failures to be discarded. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, arrived in 1816. She was 19, another cousin, full of naive hope. Her wedding night was, if anything, even worse than Maria Antonia's. The screams that echoed through the palace corridors were so loud that servants 3 floors away covered their ears. Isabel never recovered. She developed a pronounced stutter, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and showed every sign of complete psychological collapse. Ferdinand, rather than showing compassion, grew even more paranoid. He had her correspondence intercepted, her food tasted for poisons, her chambers secretly searched. His sexual dysfunction had metastasized into a political psychosis that infected his entire government. When Isabel died in 1818 after only 2 years of marriage, officially from nervous exhaustion, palace staff whispered that she may have hastened her own end through subtle forms of self-harm. Her final words, according to her confessor, were a prayer of gratitude for her approaching liberation. Ferdinand's response was not grief, but suspicion. He ordered multiple autopsies, insisting on viewing the body repeatedly, muttering about the wasted potential of her womb. He commissioned a death mask and kept it in his private chambers, where visitors reported seeing him conducting one-sided conversations with the lifeless plaster face. His third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, arrived in 1819. She was older, more worldly, and took a clinical approach to her royal duties. She brought her own physicians and kept detailed records of their encounters with the precision of a research scientist. This detachment seemed to frustrate Ferdinand even more than Isabel's terror had. He became convinced she was documenting his condition for foreign intelligence services, that every carefully recorded detail was evidence being compiled for his humiliation. In 1829, after 10 years of this clinical marriage, Maria Josepha became pregnant. The news shocked Europe. Some whispered about divine intervention. Others suggested advances in medical science. The most cynical spoke of infidelity. Ferdinand's reaction was a volatile mixture of euphoria and terror. He brought in additional guards, consulted mystics alongside trained physicians, and had her chambers blessed by every religious authority in Madrid. The pregnancy progressed until the 7th month, when complications arose. Ferdinand's interference, his insistence on following astrological charts and alchemical advice, created chaos that made effective medical intervention impossible. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The baby, a daughter, lived only a few hours. Maria Josepha survived the delivery but died 3 weeks later from infection and despair. Ferdinand refused to allow either body to be buried, insisting physicians continue attempting to revive them through increasingly bizarre means. For nearly a week, the palace filled with the stench of decay while a king clung to delusion. And then came Maria Cristina of Naples, the final wife, the final deception. What Ferdinand's advisors didn't tell him until after the wedding negotiations were complete was that Maria Cristina was already pregnant by another man. The wedding in 1829 was farcical, the bride visibly carrying a child that could not possibly be the king's. But Ferdinand was so desperate for an heir that he accepted this transparent fiction. When Isabella II was born in 1830, he knew the child was not his. Yet he had to maintain the lie, had to pretend legitimacy, had to build his succession on a foundation of mutual deception. His final years were consumed by this paranoia. He conducted midnight raids on his wife's chambers, had peepholes drilled into walls, spent hours watching her through cracks like a spy in his own palace. Maria Cristina, aware of this constant surveillance, moved through her rooms like a prisoner performing for an audience she could never see. When Ferdinand VII finally died on September 29, 1833, palace physicians privately acknowledged he had died of exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual. The secret autopsy revealed the full extent of nature's cruel joke. His member measured over 14 inches, varying dramatically in girth, with additional tissue growths that served no biological function. More disturbing was the discovery of internal scarring from decades of pathetic attempts at self-surgery, attempts to modify his anatomy in desperate secrecy, attempts that only worsened his condition and deepened his trauma. You finish your grim work as the candles burn lower. The preserved organ, along with detailed medical drawings, will be sealed and sent to the Vatican archives, where it remains today, one of history's most bizarre state secrets, buried beneath centuries of discretion and shame. You wash your hands, but you know you'll never feel clean again. Ferdinand's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on in civil war, economic collapse, and a kingdom torn between competing visions of legitimacy. Isabella II, the daughter who was not his, inherited a nation he had broken through decades of paranoia, cruelty, and dysfunction. His reign demonstrated how individual psychological damage can metastasize into collective trauma, how private shame, when wielded by absolute power, becomes public disaster. As you leave the chamber that night in 1833, you carry with you not just the physical evidence of a king's deformity, but the knowledge of what that deformity created. A ruler who saw other human beings not as individuals deserving of dignity, but as tools, obstacles, or threats. A man so consumed by his own shame that he transformed an entire kingdom into a mirror of his internal torture. Ferdinand VII achieved a kind of immortality, not as a great king, but as a cautionary tale about the corruption of unchecked authority and the terrible power of shame left to fester in the dark. The preserved organ rests in its sealed vault in Vatican City, a monument to a truth too disturbing for history books to fully acknowledge, too human for legend to embrace, and too tragic for time to heal. It is the physical evidence of a reign that consumed everything it touched, a reminder that some secrets are not just kept but carefully preserved, locked away where they can neither be forgotten nor fully confronted. And in that sealed darkness, Ferdinand's final legacy waits, a grotesque testament to the distance between what we inherit and what we become, between the body we're born with and the choices we make with the power it brings.